Most people think they knew Gene Wilder. The wild hair, the mischievous grin, the unforgettable roles that made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. But behind those whimsical performances and candy-colored sets was a man carrying something far heavier than anyone realized. For decades, Wilder kept a secret most fans never imagined, a truth that shaped his career, haunted his personal life, and ultimately defined the way he saw the world. His performances weren't just funny. They were a kind of shield, a carefully crafted illusion hiding real heartbreak, early trauma, and private battles that he never shared publicly until the very end. The truth? Gene Wilder wasn't just an actor playing eccentric roles. He was a man using comedy to survive because from the time he was a little boy, laughter wasn't just entertainment. It was a lifeline. But before Hollywood, before the fame, and long before Willy Wonka or Blazing Saddles, everything started with one impossible moment that changed his life forever. Gene Wilder wasn't born Gene Wilder. He came into the world as Jerome Silberman in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in 1933, just a quiet, wide-eyed boy growing up in a Jewish household, shaped by tradition, resilience, and the lingering weight of European roots. But by the time he turned 8, something happened that would split his childhood in two. His mother, Jean, was diagnosed with rheumatic fever, a brutal illness that weakened her heart and turned their family's life upside down. Doctors warned the young Jerome that any emotional stress could be dangerous for her. And then came the advice that changed everything. Try to make her laugh. That simple sentence hit him like a mission. He wasn't trying to be funny for fun, he was doing it to keep her alive. Every goofy face, every exaggerated voice, every awkward impersonation, it wasn't about applause. It was about survival. This wasn't the origin of a career. This was the origin of purpose. And it worked. His mother, despite her illness, became his first audience and his most devoted one. She saw something special in him before anyone else did. While other kids were out playing baseball, Gene was learning how to twist pain into humor, fear into jokes. He wasn't escaping reality, he was reshaping it. But even with his mother's encouragement, there was one undeniable truth. Milwaukee wasn't a place where dreamers made it big, and that's when his story took a dramatic turn. At just 13 years old, Gene's mother made a decision that most parents wouldn't even consider. She sent him across the country to Hollywood, not for a vacation, not to chase fame, but to give her son a chance to escape the limits of their small town and get closer to the heart of the entertainment world. She enrolled him in the Black Fox Military Institute, a strict boarding school just miles from the major studios. It sounded glamorous. It wasn't. Gene didn't fit in with the other boys, not with the military discipline, and definitely not with the unspoken social hierarchy that surrounded him. The very place meant to bring him closer to his dreams ended up making him feel even more like an outsider. He lasted just a year. But something about that year stuck. The palm trees, the studio gates, the feeling that maybe if he could just survive it, there was something waiting for him on the other side of rejection. He left Hollywood not as a failure, but as a boy with a sharper edge, one who had tasted the system and realized he'd have to earn his way back. Back home in Wisconsin, Gene didn't sulk. He dove headfirst into local theater. School plays, community productions, Shakespeare under the lights of a makeshift stage. This was where he started building his foundation. By 15, he performed in Romeo and Juliet, delivering lines with a fire that surprised even the adults around him. It wasn't the fame he had imagined at 13, but it was real. It was raw, and it was his. What he didn't know then was that his path wouldn't go straight to stardom. First, he'd be forced to take a Deterone that would test not just his dedication, but his entire identity. By the early 1950s, Gene had sharpened his talent through theater, earned a degree in communication and drama, and even studied in England at the prestigious Bristol Old Vic. He was on the verge of something, but life, once again, had other plans. In 1956, the draft came calling. Just as his career was beginning to gain traction, Wilder was pulled into the U.S. Army. For many young men, the uniform meant lost time and forgotten dreams. But Gene had a different idea. If he couldn't escape the system, he'd find a way to work within it. Stationed first in Texas, then Pennsylvania, he cleverly maneuvered his assignment to serve as a paramedic in the psychiatry and neurology department. It was a strategic move one that let him remain near New York, where he could still sneak off to study acting at night. It was a strange double life. By day, he wore a uniform and worked in hospitals. By night, he returned to his craft quietly, obsessively. Most of his peers were out drinking or counting the days until discharge. Gene was working side jobs, attending classes, and pushing his skills further than ever. Then tragedy struck. In 1957, shortly before his honorable discharge, his mother, his first audience, his greatest supporter, passed away. The grief hit hard, but like everything in his life, Wilder didn't let it break him. He took the pain and folded it into his work. The laughter became sharper, the characters more layered, the performances more personal. By the time he returned to New York full-time, he wasn't just chasing a dream anymore. He was honoring a promise. But the real transformation was still coming. Because once Gene walked into the classroom of one legendary acting teacher, everything would change forever. Back in New York, Gene Wilder threw himself into the city's theater scene like a man on a mission, but survival didn't come easy. Rent was due, food wasn't guaranteed, and acting gigs barely paid the bills. To stay afloat, he worked every odd job he could find: fencing instructor, limousine driver, toy salesman. During the day, he hustled for money. At night, he studied. It was during this time that Gene found himself in the classroom of Lee Strasberg, the father of method acting, and mentor to legends like Marlon Brando, Marilyn Monroe, and James Dean. Getting in wasn't easy. Being noticed was even harder. But something about Gene stood out. It wasn't his voice. It wasn't his look. It was the vulnerability. Strasberg saw it right away. This wasn't just a funny man. This was someone who had lived through something. And that pain, that emotional depth, gave his performances a raw, unpredictable edge. Under Strasberg's guidance, Wilder's craft changed completely. He stopped performing characters and started becoming them. Eventually, Gene was accepted into the prestigious Actors Studio and Elite group of the most promising talents in America. But even there, surrounded by rising stars, he never let go of the insecurity that had followed him since childhood. He didn't have connections. He didn't have money. All he had was the work. While others looked the part, Gene felt it. Audiences didn't know it yet, but the quiet man in the back of the theater, taking notes and wiping tables at night, would soon redefine what comedy could be. And it would all start with one role and one woman, who would introduce him to the man that would change everything. In 1963, after years of scraping by and performing in off-Broadway productions, Gene landed a part in Mother Courage and Her Children. It was a big break, but not for the reasons he expected. Opposite him on stage was Anne Bancroft, already an acclaimed actress. Offstage, she was in a relationship with a then-unknown writer and director named Mel Brooks. What happened next wasn't just a casting coincidence, it was a seismic shift. Anne saw something in Gene. Maybe it was his nervous charm, or the way his performances teetered between hilarious and heartbreaking. Whatever it was, she decided to introduce him to Mel. Their first meeting wasn't a formal audition, it was just a conversation. But that conversation sparked something undeniable. Mel saw in Gene what few others had, an actor who could be hysterically funny and deeply human at the same time. Years later, Brooks would say that Gene wasn't just a performer, he was a secret weapon. Soon after, Gene was cast as Leo Bloom in The Producers, a manic accountant trapped in a ridiculous scheme to create the worst Broadway show in history. But what Gene brought to the role wasn't just comedy, it was panic, heart, and a level of vulnerability that made every meltdown feel real. The performance earned him an Academy Award nomination. It also cemented a creative partnership that would define both of their careers. But what no one knew then was just how far they would push each other and how that partnership would lead to one of the most controversial, misunderstood, and secretly profound comedies ever made. When Blazing Saddles hit theaters in 1974, audiences didn't know what to make of it. A Western spoof filled with slapstick, absurd gags, and jokes that seemed designed to offend everyone in sight. It was loud. It was chaotic. It was unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. But to Gene Wilder, it was much more than a comedy. It was a risk, a challenge, and a balancing act that could have easily collapsed into disaster. He wasn't originally supposed to be in it. The role of the washed-up gunslinger the Waco Kid was offered to someone else. But when that actor dropped out last minute, Mel Brooks turned to the one person he trusted to save the film, Gene. Wilder showed up with no prep, no ego, and one goal: make it work. And he did more than that. He brought soul to a movie built on chaos. On the surface, the Waco Kid was just another ridiculous character in an already outrageous script. But Wilder played him with a strange gracia, tired, haunted calm beneath the madness. He wasn't just there for laughs, he was there to mean something. And decades later, Wilder finally admitted why. In interviews, he revealed that Blazing Saddles wasn't just about making people laugh. It was about sneaking in a message that would hit harder than anyone expected. He called it a Trojan horse, a film that used absurdity to deliver serious truths about racism, prejudice, and the American psyche. The jokes weren't just jokes, they were camouflage. Wilder said that the goal was to make people laugh first, then realize what they were laughing at. The comedy disarmed them, and only afterward would the deeper message sink in. Behind the scenes, though, the weight of that message wasn't easy to carry. There were moments during filming when the cast, including Wilder, would quietly question what they were doing. Could this actually work? Were they going too far? Would anyone even understand what they were trying to say? But that's what made Blazing Saddles endure. Beneath every outrageous moment was intent. Beneath every punchline was purpose. And Gene Wilder was right in the middle, balancing satire and sincerity with a kind of precision only he could pull off. Still, even as the film gained cult status, most fans never knew the truth. The funniest movie of the decade was also one of the most personal, vulnerable projects Wilder ever touched. And the emotional cost of carrying that double meaning wouldn't be the last weight he had to bear. Because just a few years later, Wilder's brightest love would arrive, followed by the darkest chapter of his life. When Gene Wilder met Gilda Radner, it felt like something out of one of his own films, charming, a little chaotic, and too perfect to question. They were cast opposite each other in the 1981 film Hanky Panky, but what started as an on-screen romance quickly became something much deeper off-screen. Gilda, the Saturday Night Live superstar with razor-sharp wit and infectious energy, seemed like a perfect match for Gene's quiet brilliance. Where he was reflective, she was electric. Where he was subtle, she was a storm. But they understood each other in a way that didn't need explanation. By 1984, they were married in the south of Francia, picturesque ceremony that made headlines and made fans believe in happy endings. For a while, it looked like they had found it. But just 2 years later, Gilda was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. The diagnosis hit like a freight train. The woman who had lit up every room was suddenly fighting for her life, and Wilder, the man who had made the world laugh for decades, was suddenly the one holding the line. He stood by her through it all. The treatments, the setbacks, the brief moments of hope, and the crushing waves of fear. He put his career on hold. He became her caregiver. He watched the person he loved most in the world slip away day by day, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. For 3 long years, Gene stayed by Gilda's side, refusing to leave her alone for even a moment. He made her laugh when he could. He stayed strong when she couldn't. And when she passed away in 1989, it broke something in him that never fully healed. But Gene didn't disappear. Instead, he turned his grief into action. He helped establish Gilda's Kluba support organization for cancer patients and their families. He spoke publicly about her battle, even when it hurt, because he knew that if he stayed silent, her story might fade. And he wasn't about to let that happen. It was a love story that started on a film set and ended far too soon. And for Gene, it became the most defining role of his life, not as a character, but as a partner, a protector, and a man who proved, without ever saying it, that real love doesn't disappear when the laughter fades. But even after loss, life wasn't done with him yet. In the years that followed, Gene Wilder would step back from the spotlight, but not before revealing one final truth, quietly and with the same grace he carried his whole life. By the time the 2000s arrived, Gene Wilder had already stepped back from Hollywood. He wasn't chasing roles anymore. He wasn't attending red carpets. He had given the world decades of unforgettable characters, but behind closed doors, something far more personal was unfolding. In 2013, Gene was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. It was a brutal twist for a man whose entire career had been built on imagination, timing, memory, and emotion. The disease began to take hold quietly, slowly pulling at the sharpness that had defined his every performance. But unlike many public figures, Wilder made a decision that spoke volumes about who he truly was. He chose to keep it private. Only a handful of people knew, not out of pride, not out of denial, but because Gene didn't want the world to worry. He didn't want fans to see Willy Wonka fade. He didn't want a child's smile to turn into confusion because the man from their favorite movie was now sick. His nephew would later explain that Gene feared the loss of joy, that a diagnosis made public would cast a shadow over the happiness he'd brought to generations of children and adults alike. And so he kept it to himself until the very end. He spent those final years in quiet dignity, living in Connecticut with his fourth wife, Karen Webb. Their marriage, steady and private, gave him the peace that had often eluded him in earlier years. They went for walks. They listened to music. They watched old movies. He smiled when kids on the street still called him Willy Wonka. And he never corrected them. On the 29th of August, 2016, Gene Wilder passed away peacefully at the age of 83. It was the kind of ending he would have written for someone else. Soft, dignified, and full of meaning. No spectacle, no press tour, just a final curtain drawn with grace. And yet, even in death, Gene left something behind, not just a body of work, but a lesson. That comedy can be born from pain. That kindness doesn't need an audience. And that sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who carry the most without ever letting it show. But before we say goodbye, there's one final truth worth remembering. Because what most fans still don't realize is that Gene Wilder wasn't just a character actor or a Hollywood icon. He was something even rarer. He was real. It's easy to remember Gene Wilder for the purple coat and the wild eyes, for the nervous energy of Leo Bloom, or the deadpan brilliance of the Waco Kid, for the way he made absurdity feel intelligent and madness seem meaningful. But beneath every line, every role, and every carefully timed pause, there was a man quietly working through his own story, one that most of us never saw. Because Gene wasn't just performing, he was translating, taking grief, insecurity, love, loss, and fear and turning them into something the world could laugh at, or cry with, or feel a little less alone because of. He never chased attention. He didn't live for fame. In fact, the older he got, the more he pulled away from the spotlight. Not because he was fading, but because he had already given us everything we needed. A body of work filled with heart, a career built on intention, and a legacy that refuses to fade even now. Blazing Saddles, Young Frankenstein, Willy Wonka. These weren't just movies, they were pieces of Gene's soul, carefully stitched together with laughter and pain in equal parts. He taught us that comedy can be a disguise, that absurdity can carry truth, and that sometimes the funniest people are the ones carrying the heaviest weight. So the next time you see him on screen staring down a crowd of Oompa Loompas or delivering a line with that signature twitch of the eye, remember this: Gene Wilder wasn't trying to be remembered. He was just trying to make his mother laugh. And in the end, maybe that's what made him unforgettable.